Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out this Monday morning. Happy post-Thanksgiving. I hope you enjoyed your holiday. Today's event is looking at the implications of the 2024 U.S. presidential election on U.S.-China relations. My name is Kristen Looney. I'm an associate professor of Asian Studies and Government here at Georgetown University, where I teach courses on China, Taiwan, East Asia, and I also advise many theses. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to just briefly introduce our guests. Sitting next to me is Dennis Wilder. He's a senior fellow at the Initiative for the U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, which is sponsoring this event, and a professor of practice in Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. And then joining us online, we have Da Wei, who is a professor at the Department of International Relations, School of Social Sciences at the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. And I understand is joining us from California?
No,
is that correct?
Wu Xingbo.
Oh, Wu Xingbo is joining us from California. So Professor Da Wei is joining us from Beijing, from Tsinghua. Thank you for coming. And then we also have Professor Wu Xingbo, who is a professor and dean of the Institute of International Studies and director of the Center for American Studies at Fudan University in Shanghai, who is dialing in from California. That was my mistake. And then finally, we have Bilahari Kasakan. He is the chairman of the Middle East Institute, which is an autonomous institute of the National University of Singapore. Thank you so much for joining us online. Instead of having everybody do introductory remarks, I'm going to start with a general question, which is, how do you evaluate the state of U.S.-China relations today, and how do you expect it to change under Trump? I'll follow up with more specific questions, but I want to get your overall take about how you see the relationship evolving with the new administration taking office. So perhaps we could start with Professor Wu, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Good morning. Thanks for the invitation. I don't think the current state of China-U.S. relations is good, but it's overall manageable. This relationship has been tense with constant frictions. But on the other hand, the two sides have managed to keep open the channel of communication, dialogue, and have conducted cooperation in certain areas of mutual concern. I think both Beijing and Washington have an interest in not allowing a major conflict to occur in this relationship. So that is what I take as the current state of this relationship. Now, think about the second Trump administration. I'm afraid we are going to see a more turbulent and conflictual relationship. Tensions will go high, and there may be some serious crises and conflicts in this relationship. At the same time, I guess the channel of communication and dialogue will be reduced. And also the areas of cooperation will shrink. So that's a more worrisome direction that this relationship may move down the road in the next 4 years.
Thank you so much. Professor Da Wei, would you mind weighing in and answering the same question?
Sure, definitely. Thank you. First of all, thanks for having me for this wonderful panel. So I think I echo many things that Professor Wu has already said. I will say the China-U.S. relations in past 4 years has been an L-shaped relationship. So in the first 3 years, I think the bilateral relations deteriorated, along with the direction started from the Trump administration. But in the final year, in the 4th year, I think it's stabilized a lot, and the two sides set up many communication channels and also do something to improve the atmosphere. Of course, it's not an essential improvement. It's not a good relationship. It's still dangerous, but I will say it's much better. At least the atmosphere has been better. And but now looking at the second Trump administration, I'm afraid we will see another round of free fall in China-U.S. relations, at least in the first year and maybe perhaps before the midterm election in the United States, particularly on those pure bilateral issues like trade, investment, people to people, and maybe other things. So I also agree that we will have many difficulties in the environment, lack of effective communication channels. At the same time, I think the Trump administration may create some chaos on international arena, which could lead to some interesting changes of the international order and international structure. So from that perspective, maybe it's not a purely bad thing for China. It could be bad, it could be good. It depends on how different actors, players interact with each other. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Kasakan, would you mind weighing in?
Okay, first of all, I am no sort of professor. I profess nothing. But, I kind of agree with both my Chinese colleagues. Look, let's not exaggerate the whole change of administration into change of U.S.-China relations. There is going to be a lot of continuity. It's going to be primarily a competitive relationship. What exactly in the particulars is going to be changed, we can't really predict right now, but it's going to be more or less continuity. A higher degree of competitiveness, a higher degree of tension, but not to the extent that they will lead to conflict. So let's not exaggerate things.
Okay. And Dennis, would you like to weigh in? Professor Wilder.
Sure. Dennis is fine. I think the Trump administration is really hard to predict. And strangely, I would say that I'm a little more optimistic because it's hard to predict. I am struck by the fact that none of his national security team, although they talk a lot about China, has ever been to China. Not one of them. If somebody knows one of them who has, I'd like to hear about it. Whereas Trump and his new confidant, Elon Musk, have extensive experience with China. And so one of the questions I have is, how much advice on China is he going to take from guys who've never even been there, who've never even talked with the Chinese leadership? Their experience is all with Taiwan. They've all been to Taiwan. They've all met with the Taiwan leadership. So they know China from the Taiwan perspective. So I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic. And as we know from the first administration, and if you read Bolton's book or Pompeo's book, you know that Trump routinely goes his own way and that he does not necessarily follow the advice of his advisors. So while people like Marco Rubio, very hard line on China, the question is how much real influence over Trump they're going to have. There is a little problem with Rubio. I don't know if you know this, but he's sanctioned by the Chinese. So the Chinese are going to have to come up with an artful way to unsanction him at this point. I would say that another aspect of this is that because they don't know China, I would strongly recommend that the dialogue between Wang Yi and the National Security Advisor continue. This is a very important part of the communications because if you notice the Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi meetings, they're done in secret. They usually take 2 days. Nobody has to come out and report on the meetings, unlike when the two foreign minister, Secretary of State meet. The Secretary of State has to brief Congress. The National Security Advisor doesn't, so it can be a much more candid discussion. So I would recommend that continue. A third point I'd make just quickly is one of the things we have to deal with in the relationship is the demonization on both sides and the victimization on both sides. China demonizes the United States as trying to suppress and contain China. The United States demonizes China by saying it wants to conquer the world. In terms of victimization, the Chinese kind of continue that the United States is really just part of the 100 years, the century of humiliation. This is just a continuation. Whereas on the US side, if you listen to people like Gina Raimondo, China stole everything. You know, she tells the story of her father, worked in a Bulova watch factory. The factory moves to Shenzhen, and the family finances collapse. Well, we all know that it's globalization, not China, that made these changes. So unless we can get by some of this, I don't have prospects for huge improvement in the relationship.
Can you explain for the audience why Marco Rubio is sanctioned?
I believe it's over Xinjiang and Hong Kong, as I recall. So, but you know, there's an artful way to do this where you can say the sanctions are on Rubio as a person, but in his official capacity of Secretary of State, of course, he's welcomed in China. And I would guess that's the way the Chinese are going to resolve it.
Well, I want to pivot to talking about Taiwan for a little bit. We'll come back to the U.S.-China bilateral relationship soon, but you mentioned Taiwan in your comments. And, you know, some people are concerned that Trump does not care enough about Taiwanese democracy to offer it assistance in case of mainland interference or mainland threats. But he has chosen some hardline people, such as Rubio, who are in the administration. So I'm just who will be in the administration. Just wondering if you think that U.S.-Taiwan policy is going to change at all in the next several years. Well, maybe I'll start with you, and then we can go back to the online audience, since you raised that issue. Yeah.
This is another really fascinating conundrum, because Trump is famous for saying that the resolute desk in the Oval Office is China, and this pen cap is Taiwan. Which do you think I care more about? So Trump's attitude toward Taiwan is peace through strength, in other words, deterring China from coercive action. But he is not ideological in any sense of the word, and therefore democracy as a concept is not particularly high on his agenda. Whereas for people like Rubio, this is very high on their agenda. Now, I think that Beijing is relieved that Mike Pompeo was not selected into the administration, because he is very far forward on the Taiwan issue and wants Taiwan to declare independence. So I think the fear in Taiwan is that Trump may see Taiwan as a bit of trade space with Beijing. There are certainly things that Beijing has wanted this administration to do that he might be willing to do. For example, we publicly say in the United States government that we do not support independence. The Chinese would like us to go further and say we oppose independence. Now, Trump might be willing to say that. So there is room for a bit of a change on this issue, given Trump's personal proclivities.
Professor Wu, do you have thoughts on U.S.-Taiwan policy and how that might change with the coming administration?
Yes, sure. First, I want to clarify one thing you said, the U.S. commitment to Taiwanese democracy. I don't think that's a major dynamic driving the U.S. policy towards Taiwan, because U.S. has committed to Taiwan's security ever since the 1950s, way before Taiwan became a democracy. So I think the main dynamics behind U.S.-Taiwan policy is more of geopolitics rather than value democracy. I have a concern that something may go wrong on the Taiwan issue in the next 4 years. The Trump administration may play the Taiwan card while it tries to push China on other issues, especially on trade and economic issues. So as this happened before with the U.S. Governments, from time to time, they want to play this card against China if they want to push China in other areas. Another possibility is that within the Trump administration, you have the so-called ideological hawks or geopolitical hawks who are very pro-Taiwan, like Rubio. So they may want to push a very hardline agenda on the Taiwan issue. And I don't think Trump always keep a close eye on the Taiwan issue. That means maybe it's just because of his negligence, some trouble will occur on the Taiwan issue. So in that case, what will China do? I think first and foremost, Beijing will do whatever it takes to show that it can keep the situation in the Taiwan Strait under control, not allowing Taiwan to become independent with the support from the United States. And secondly, if the US side really cross the red line, I think Beijing will show how damaging this will be to bilateral relationship. So at some point, tension will go up, crisis, may occur, and even some kind of conflict is inevitable on the Taiwan issue. So that's my concern on this question.
Professor Dawei, I'm anxious to hear your thoughts as well about about Taiwan policy in the coming administration.
Yes, I think both Professor Wilder and Wu already touch upon the unpredictability of the next 4 years on this issue. There are many different possibilities. Of course, I know several things. One is the first one. I think President-elect Trump himself does not want to see a war over Taiwan with China. Secondly, he is surrounded by many super hawks who is pro-Taiwan and very anti-China. Thirdly, during his term, during President Trump's second term, Taiwan authority will face the task of get a re-election. So all those things will bring in some, uncertainties. It could be something maybe towards a positive direction, as Professor Wilder suggested. It could be something bad, as Professor Wu suggested. But my concern is those positive changes from Chinese perspective, of course, is always reversible. So the Congress and the next president could change that position. Even if he say, we oppose Taiwan's independence, then it could be, overturned overnight. But if there's something bad happen, I think that will be disastrous for everybody. So this is my concern. I want to emphasize the danger that in next 4 years, the leader in Taiwan need to seek re-election, and there is a possibility that he has a motivation to create some crisis to mobilize his bases. Then I wonder, my concern is maybe President Trump and his team may find this is an opportunity for them to utilize in order to strike a deal with China. So those will be very dangerous game. So I'd rather there's no change at all. So I have no expectation towards any deal with the United States over Taiwan. I'd rather it maintain stable and the predictability. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ambassador Kasakan, would you like to say anything about Taiwan? I know maybe perhaps from the Southeast Asian perspective or Singapore's individual perspective, I know Taiwan has made a lot of investments in trying to increase its influence and soft power and trade relations with Southeast Asia, beginning with Tsai Ing-wen. There's the new southbound policy. There's also efforts ongoing to try to bolster up support in the region to kind of counterbalance China's influence. And I'm just wondering from the Southeast Asian perspective how you see those efforts and the prospect of continued stability or perhaps unraveling of stability in the Taiwan Strait.
All right, let me make a few points, right? First, there is no Southeast Asian perspective on Taiwan. There are several Southeast Asian perspectives on Taiwan. Let's not go into that because it will take up the rest of our time. Secondly, I think, look, Taiwan is a sensitive issue, extremely sensitive issue. It's the most volatile potential flashpoint. However, I think kind of paradoxically, it is fairly stable because it's so sensitive. Nobody wants trouble. Nobody wants a war over Taiwan. What I was listening to the previous speakers, all three of them, and I kind of agree with them, but I will just make a slight nuance, if I may. Nobody is going to support Taiwan independence. In fact, even the Taiwanese don't want Taiwanese independence. They just want the status quo to continue. Secondly, however, the prospect of a voluntary reunification is rather slim because they want the status quo to continue. So how do we manage this situation? I think the danger is that, look, Biden said 4 times, I will support Taiwan if China attacks it, right? And 4 times his own staff kind of tried to walk that back. Everybody forgot the walking back part. The Taiwanese in particular forgot the walking back part, or they chose to forget. So there's a certain sense of entitlement in Taiwan, which I find rather disturbing. That somebody must support me. Somebody must support me because I'm a democracy. Somebody must support me because I'm a great chip fabricator. Somebody must support me for some reason. Now, if Mr. Trump is definitely not going to say what Mr. Biden said, right? I think we all can understand that. And that is actually quite healthy because if it pours a healthy dose of cold water over the Taiwanese sense of entitlement, that somebody is going to support me, then they will probably start to look at themselves in the world in a more realistic way. The Taiwanese, I think, place too much emphasis on TSMC, which is a wonderful fabricator of chips. We all know that, right? It's probably the best fabricator in the world. But after all, it is only a contract manufacturer. So you may make it better than anybody else, but it doesn't mean anybody else cannot make it. So I think there are 2 sides of the Taiwan Straits. The Chinese have to calm down and the Taiwanese have to calm down. If Mr. Trump can calm both sides down, we are all going to be very happy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That actually raises another question that I wanted to ask, which is about U.S. technology policy. Because so much of our technology restrictions towards China are about protecting U.S. chip manufacturing capability or keeping it in the hands of Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, other kind of like-minded allied countries or ally-adjacent countries. And so I'm wondering if you all think that these restrictions are going to stay in place in the coming years. Restrictions on critical technologies going to China. Maybe the restrictions will expand under the Trump administration. Just wondering how you view the evolution of tech policy in the coming years, and also what China's response might be to continued restrictions. Would anyone like to start with that?
Start.
Yes, go ahead,
Let me
Professor.
start. The Biden administration said small yard, high fence, right? I think the fences are going to remain as high. The yard might expand. But it's a fact of life. This is a strategic competition. Technology is one of the dimensions of a strategic competition. So anybody thinks it's going to change just because Trump is not Biden or Biden is not Trump, you should stop smoking whatever you are smoking.
Yes, go ahead, Dennis.
I think one dimension we haven't talked about yet is the U.S. Congress. And if you look at the Gallagher Committee, now the Molinar Committee, you can see that Congress is very seized with this issue. And so I think there will be pressure from the Congress to go further than the Biden administration. For example, on investment in China, the Biden administration didn't do anything in the neurotechnology or the biotechnology sectors. And I think the Congress is going to focus on that and put some pressure on the Trump administration to start closing what they see as loopholes. One of the problems that you have, and it's a dynamic in the US government that is very hard to deal with, is our actual scientific level of expertise in the US government is not as high as it is in the American private sector today. Google and these other companies are way out ahead in understanding emerging technologies. And government officials are kind of running behind them. And so trying to figure out which technologies should be restricted is really a dynamic between the private sector and the government sector. The problem is, of course, the private sector doesn't want too many restrictions. They're in the profit-making business. And the US government is saying to the private sector, but you got to tell us where we need to restrict. So I think this is going to be a very interesting dynamic to continue to follow because, as many people have said, we've got to increase the level of technological expertise in the US government if we're going to do this well. And these kinds of sanctions are only done well if they are very targeted. If they're too broad, your allies won't go along with you. The companies won't go along with you. The black marketers will find ways around you. So we are involved in a grand experiment here, and I'm not sure where we come out.
Yes, but given the politics, it's likely that restrictions will continue and expand. So it may be a larger yard and a higher fence. And I'm wondering if Professors Dawei and Usinbo could comment on China's response to U.S. technology restrictions. I mean, these have been in place under the Biden administration. If we can presume that they're going to expand under the Trump administration, will China maybe you can talk a little bit about how China has already adjusted to these restrictions and any kind of tweaks to that strategy moving forward. Would one of you like to respond first?
Well, let me chip in on this topic. I think for the U.S., the efforts to launch the export control sanctions, crackdown on Chinese technological advances, has been driven by the concern over, this may somehow enhance China's strategic capacity in important technological areas. And this will also enhance China's military capability. I think the Trump administration will certainly continue along with the line as the Biden administration has done, and may even broaden the parameter of technological control vis-a-vis China, to be sure. Now, what China has been doing and will continue to do is, China will be more committed to indigenous innovation. So just look how much China has invested heavily in the chip industry in the last several years, and as well as in other areas, under the U.S. restriction, like quantum, AI, biotech. So, China has no choice. We cannot expect the U.S. to change its mind in the foreseeable future. So the only way to move forward is to push for indigenous innovation. And given the larger scale of Chinese market, I think the private sector in China, actually, they are very much encouraged by this situation. Because in the past, because we can easily get the advanced chips from the US, from abroad, that make it more difficult for domestic firms to develop their own capacity in this regard. But now here comes the great opportunities. So I think this is the primary thing that China will continue to do, to invest in its own indigenous innovation. Secondly, China will continue to work with other countries, broadly we call it third parties. I mean, the US does not control all these important technologies, either as a matter of, know-how or its manufacturing capacity. So it needs, the cooperation from many other countries, which in my opinion is very, very difficult. Because for many other countries, for their companies, they have their economic incentives. So that gives China the opportunity to break up the US restrictions. Now, I think in the long run, the US may find this kind of policy unsustainable because, as indicated by Dennis at some point, I think the value of technology is not how advanced it is, but how profitable it can be in the market. So China, with the largest market, most profitable market for some of the technologies like the chips. If the US, is going to impose more restrictions on export to China, I think the US companies are going to lose the Chinese market forever. If one day the US come back, say, we change our mind, we want to, re-export those stuff to you, I think China wouldn't buy that. So that will have a lot of impact on the capacity of US private sectors, the technology companies, when it comes to, funding the research and development so that they can, stay at the top of the technology chain. So only when the US finds this is, not sustainable and self-hurting, then it may have the incentive to reconsider its current policy. Yes.
Thank you. So it sounds like from your perspective, indigenous innovation policies in China, such as Made in China 2025, are working, and the private sector has benefited actually from some of these restrictions and export controls on technology. Professor Dawei, do you agree with that perspective? Do you have any other points you would like to add to the conversation?
Yes, of course. I won't say all the companies, private companies, benefit from the sanctions or restrictions. Some of them benefit from that. Some of them suffered from that, of course. Uh, but it's not a completely dark picture, that's for sure. And another thing I want to add is, this new technology is not only those like, you know, chat GPT thing, of course, that's very important. But I mean, you have to make your new high technology industrialized. You need to combine it with manufacturing sectors. So where China is the biggest manufacturing power in the world. So like on the in industries like EV, like automatic driving, drone. I think China is probably, particularly in Guangdong, Shenzhen area, that's the biggest producer of those. And if you combine, I think all the new technology need to be materialized, and you need to make profit, and you need to make it industrialized. I think China has a very good potential to achieve that. So of course, China suffer from that. If the ideal situation is we can combine the innovation in the U.S. with the industrial capability in China, that will be fantastic. But now you don't have that. So the second to the best solution is indigenous innovation, and also working with other countries, like Professor Wu said, and also working with some American companies in the area out of the yard. Then combine it with China's manufacturing capability. I think there is a potential that maybe China's economy can get out of this difficult period. But I have to say, those restrictions did make some trouble for China's technology and economy. But it's not just a clear-cut picture that China suffer U.S. benefit. I think it's more complicated picture. Maybe both sides suffer.
Thank you so much. And related to the economy, I do want to talk about trade. One thing we know for sure is that tariffs are coming back. I mean, tariffs are still in place. They never went away, but we're going to see additional tariffs put on goods imported from China. I believe the number I read in the news was an additional 10% on all Chinese goods coming into the United States, on top of what is already in existence. So I'd like to hear everybody's perspective on this policy's usefulness for what Trump hopes to accomplish in the U.S.-China trade relationship. And is there anything that you think would cause Trump to maybe reconsider tariffs, like if there's another, significant trade deal that's reached with Chinese negotiators? But yeah, what do you think about tariff policy advancing U.S. economic interests? And is there anything that would make Trump back down from that? Dennis, would you like to start?
Okay. I hate to keep saying these things are very complicated with Trump, but they are. There's an interesting line of reasoning within the Trump group that says, if we put high tariffs on China, we will have the money, the revenues, to offset the tax reductions we are hoping to continue and give Americans. So they are looking at this not just as a way to punish China or perhaps decouple from China, but actually as a revenue stream to deal with the shortage of funds, to deal with some of the things they want to do. Obviously, I would not be surprised if President Xi tries to cut a deal with Trump on these issues. A deal was struck with Liu He in 2000 that, because of COVID and other reasons, did not really get consummated. But you could see the Chinese offering to buy more, God help them, Boeings, and more soybeans. And, you know, given the status Chinese economy, they can shift from Brazil to the United States if they want to buy more soybeans or whatever. So I wouldn't rule out another trade deal. But again, it gets very complicated by the other priorities of the Trump administration. Now, you can see already, and frankly, I'm surprised how early he did this, but Trump is already using tariffs as a cudgel. You know, the leader of Canada had to come and kiss the ring in Mar-a-Lago this weekend. The Mexican leader had to immediately reach out to Trump. This is what Trump wants. He wants these leaders to have to come to him, to have to respond to his demands. And so it's both a tool of Trump negotiating strategy, but it's also a part of the entire economic package for the administration.
Thank you. Ambassador Kasakan, would you like to share your views about tariffs, increased tariffs on China?
Look,
Or all trade partners?
I think there will be some tariffs, all right? But I think tariffs on China are essentially a negotiating tool. I think that is generally what Dennis was trying to say in his more diplomatic way than me. So, you know, it's a deal. Trump wants a deal. So tariffs is the negotiating leverage. But can I make another point on the previous point?
Of course.
I think the issue that you raised, look, I don't think Mr. Trump has any deep ideology. So everything is a negotiation. Technology, yeah, I think that is the one possible exception. It's going to be a wider yard, but a higher fence. But, you know, so what? What's new? What's new is not in kind. It's just a different way of doing things. Our Chinese colleagues said correctly that will try to incentivize China to become more self-sufficient. I don't think either the U.S. can kind of diversify itself out of China to the extent it hopes, nor do I think that Chinese can become as self-sufficient to the extent they hope. Whether they like it or not, they gotta work to each other. Right? They don't like it, they hate it actually. Right? But they gotta try to work it out. And I think eventually they will. Tariffs is a sideshow to me. To me, it's a sideshow. There will be tariffs. It will disrupt things. But it's not going to disrupt things in a very fundamental, existential way. It's all partly is performative and partly it's negotiating leverage. And okay, it's more dramatic than we are used to, but it's nothing qualitatively different from what we're used to.
Thank you. Professor Wu, what do you think China's response to tariffs, to additional tariffs, is going to be, and how do you see the prospects of another trade deal being reached in order for the tariffs to come down?
Yeah. Well, I think we are not going to accept a pattern of interactions between China and U.S. that will be featured with extra tariffs, because it sounds like Trump views tariff as a panacea, it can just leverage tariff whenever it's because of a trade or technology or fentanyl, everything, or even Taiwan. So that's not going to work out. But in strict economic terms, I agree that Trump will try to impose some extra tariff on China. And China will certainly respond, tit for tat, not only in, imposing extra tariff on products from the US, but also try to punish the US in other areas. So I think, we are going to be familiar with this kind of fight that we saw during Trump's first term. At the same time, I think China will also look for opportunities to cut a deal with Trump. Deal is better than no deal. So if there are some legitimate concerns on the economic front, trade imbalance, or Trump wants to get more manufacturing job back to the US, or to get China purchase more US federal bonds. I mean, that can be a part of the deal. We can negotiate with Trump, including, for example, Trump recently just warned the BRICS countries not try to develop their own payment system, outside of the US dollar means. So I think there are potentially many areas in which that China can address the US concerns when both sides, are negotiating for a deal, even though this is going to be a complicated and painful process of bargaining and trade-off. I think for Trump, maybe at the end of the day, he will realize the limit of tariff as a leverage. One thing is that economically, the U.S. will suffer from the retaliation from other countries, not just China, if the U.S. imposes extra tariff, and U.S. customers will suffer. The U.S. industries will suffer. So economically, that doesn't work quite right, as Trump assumes. Secondly, a trade war with China will also jeopardize Trump's broader agenda in relation with China, because he needs China's cooperation and collaboration on other issues of his concern. But tariff war will only make this kind of cooperation very difficult, if not impossible. So only then maybe he can, become more cautious in wielding this, big stick of tariff. Yeah.
And Professor Dawei, how do you see tariffs as an instrument for affecting U.S.-China economic relations, but also just more broadly, how do you see U.S.-China economic relations evolving in the next 4 years?
I think the two economies are going to decouple further because of the tariff and other technological restriction. And I think no matter for whatever reason that President Trump wants to achieve, will impose tariff, which will, in my view, probably have a potential to cut China's exportation to the U.S. Into half of current level. And it's not good for China, of course, but China will be forced to do something correctly. Do some structural reforms, rely more on other markets and also domestic market. and of course try to strike a deal with the U.S. if it's possible. The problem is we don't know what does President Trump want. So if you want to reach a deal with somebody, you have to tell the other side, what do you want? He has not said anything. We don't know what, in the first term, in the first year, 2017, he said he want to talk to North Korea and seek help from China. So we helped him. Then he said the trade imbalance. Okay, we reached a deal with him in January 2020. But this time, I don't know what its goal. It's maybe I think Professor Wilder was correct. Maybe he wants some revenue. If so, how can you reach a deal if you just want the revenue? Or maybe he want to punish China for the, maybe he believed that he lost the last campaign because of China. If so, how can we reach a deal with him? If he wants some other concrete things, yeah, we are open. But to be honest, this is the second term of Trump, President Trump. So I think China is more ready. Everybody is more ready about this tariff thing. So this is not something new. I think, to be honest, I think it's quite ridiculous. Like this 10% tariff about fentanyl issue. Everybody knows that China and the U.S. are making progress, good progress, right, on fentanyl issue. Yeah, so imposing a 10% tariff because of the fentanyl not only will not achieve his goal, it will harm China-U.S. relations over the fentanyl issue and other, immigration law enforcement issue. I think that's very counterproductive, and it's also against the fact. It's not true. I mean, his accusation. So China is not going to kiss his ring, to be honest. Yeah, we are ready. We are ready if it's possible. Of course, I think if we can reach a deal sometimes next year, that will be good. But China is China. I think we are more ready than the first term.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit and ask maybe two more questions before we turn it over to our audience. We have a lot of people assembled here listening to the conversation. So my questions have to do with international relations more broadly. One is it in China's interest if Trump somehow negotiates peace between Russia and Ukraine? That's one. And then another is, how do you see the alliance system, specifically U.S. relations with its allies in the Indo-Pacific, possibly changing in the next 4 years? So, because in the past, his administration was seen as quite disruptive for traditional alliances. So why don't we start with the Ukraine question? Dennis, why don't you take it away?
Okay. I don't think there is any question in my mind that Trump wants a quick ceasefire in the Ukraine. He has appointed General Kellogg, who is very close to him, as the new negotiator on this question. Trump does not believe that we should have been in this war to begin with. He believes that NATO isn't really doing its part, that the United States is spending huge amounts of money on a war that is both unwinnable and needless. And so I see Trump reaching out very quickly to Putin on this question. I think the parameters of a ceasefire are very simple, actually. They're not that hard to figure out. The Ukrainians will not be happy with what is going to be outlined as a deal. And Europe may not be happy, but frankly, as one of my European friends said, what do we do? If the United States decides to pull out of funding this war and providing the ammunition, there's not a lot that Ukraine and the Europeans can really do. Now, one thing, and I'd like both Dawei and Wu Xingbo to perhaps comment on this. I've heard that there is a Chinese concern about a Putin-Trump rapprochement, that this may change the strategic triangle of the great powers in a certain direction, and that China may lose some leverage in the great power relationships. I find that rather fascinating. A term I've heard used is only Nixon could go to Beijing, only Trump can go to Moscow. That because his flank, his hardline flank, is well protected, he could indeed begin the bromance again with Putin. So I'd like to hear the Chinese views very much on this question.
Yeah, Professor Dawei or Wu Xingbo, would you like to comment on that, responding to what Dennis just raised?
Yes, maybe I will start from the China's assessment of the ceasefire, prospect of ceasefire. I think this is a very divided, controversial issue in China, at least among intellectuals. Also, I think similar to what Dennis asked, I think it's very controversial. There's no consensus here in China. My personal view is I think the ceasefire in Ukraine is in China's interest, because the longer the war goes, I think the bigger damage China will be caused on China, because the world will be divided into basically two blocks. U.S., EU, and other Western country in one blocks, while China, Russia, and maybe some others be put in another blocks. I think this is not the China. Actually, China. I don't think China want to be in that block, and I don't think it's true that China's policy is so consistent with those countries. So an end of or at least the ceasefire of Ukraine crisis, I think will drive the international order more towards a multipolar direction rather than bipolar direction. So I think that will be in China's interest. And to Dennis' question, again, there's no consensus, but my view is I don't worry that prospect at all, because I think there is a limit on the U.S.-Russia, reset thing. So every president of the U.S. tried to reset U.S.-Russia relations. All of them failed. I mean, the benefit the U.S. can get from a U.S.-Russia relationship is so small, while the political cost domestically is so high. So I don't worry about that too much. But I think if U.S.-Russia relationship can improve, I think that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. I hope we can give Russia bigger space. Russia is a big country. It needs space. I think too close to China. I mean, Russia's too closeness to China is not in China's interest. It's not in Russia's interest. It's not in the U.S. interest. So I hope Russia and the U.S. can have some limited improvement. I think they will have a limited improvement in the bilateral relations. I think that's in China's interest. But again, this is not a consensus. Maybe Professor Wu will criticize my view, I guess.
Yes, please, Professor Wu.
Any arrangement like peace, ceasefire, or truce will be welcomed by China, as China has, put upon over the last several years since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And I would imagine that China may be willing to provide some assistance in the process if Trump is serious, in negotiating peace agreement on the Ukraine crisis. Why? I think, that serves China's interest in two ways. Politically, it will, remove a major hurdle in relations between EU and China. Over the last several years, European countries, have repeatedly raised the issue of Ukraine in relation with China, even though China is not a party to this conflict. And also, of course, the peace agreement or ceasefire or truce will help reduce the risk of the escalation of the war in Europe, even, a nuclear war. So that's also in China's interest. On the economic side, China has suffered from this conflict. For example, many Chinese companies have been sanctioned by the U.S. allegedly for, doing the normal trade relations with Russia. And that also has to do with a lot of, overland trade connections between China and European countries, including the overland, the flight route between China and Europe and between China and U.S. So I think it's certainly in China's interest to say a ceasefire or a peace treaty on the Ukraine conflict. Should China worry about the improvement of relations between Washington and Moscow? Definitely not. Putin is smart enough in understanding the value of relations with China. And this relation, the importance of this relationship has been, further highlighted in the last several years when, Russia was somehow sanctioned and isolated by the West. And also Putin is sophisticated enough to understand limit of U.S. relations with, Russia, how far it can go during the Trump team. Because this kind of deep-rooted anti-Russian sentiment in the United States is very, very difficult for Trump to normalize ties with Russia. It's hard to imagine that Trump can really visit Moscow and have a meeting with Putin there. More likely, they are going to meet in the third place. So I think there's a long way to go for Russia, U.S. rapprochement, if that's a direction that Trump is interested in. Yeah.
And Professor Kasakan, what are your thoughts on potential, cessation of the conflict in Ukraine, the impact of U.S.-China relations, or perhaps you want to answer the other question I raised about U.S. alliances in the Indo-Pacific, how that might change?
I will answer both. But first, the first one. I think it's a bit of a fantasy to think that if you stop the war in Ukraine, even as a ceasefire, suddenly U.S.-Russia relations will improve. In that sense, I agree entirely with Professor Wu that is a bit of a naive calculation. Right? Secondly, I don't take for granted that Mr. Putin would want the war to cease right now. After all, from his point of view, he's winning. So if you're winning, why should you want to stop the war? Thirdly, I think the whole premise of your question is a certain paradigm that was based in the 1970s. There was the US, Soviet, China triangle. The Soviet Union and China were in an extremely difficult situation. And therefore, despite all the things that were antagonistic between them, Mao Zedong and Richard Nixon decided to normalize relations. Right? This is not the same situation entirely. It's completely different. But that kind of paradigm, mental paradigm, still infuses too much of our thinking about this. The fact is this: China has no other strategic partner of the same weight as Russia anywhere in the world. Ditto for Russia. They may not love each other, and I'm quite sure they don't love each other, but they need each other. So that's not going to change. Secondly, look, the whole premise that it's only Ukraine that stands between some kind of rapprochement between Russia, Putin's Russia, United States, or the West generally, is, I think, a false premise. Right? Putin is a revanchist. Right? And, even if you somehow, patch up relations with the US, that's not going to change. So I think the entire premises of your question was wrong.
Great. I'm not offended. That's great. Thank you.
I don't mean to offend you, because I know you are trying to ask a question. but your question was based on certain assumptions that many people seem to believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you mind commenting on the Indo-Pacific partners and allies of the United States? And
Indo-Pacific partners and are, I think, you're two broad categories, right? Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Australia. We took a very strong position on Ukraine, on the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But we did so for different reasons. But never mind about the different reasons, we took a strong position. The rest of the region is more ambivalent. It's more ambivalent because we see double standards at play here. I don't want to go into that because we can get we'll go on too long. But that's not really relevant. The relevant point is this: Ukraine is a very important issue, is a vital issue to Europe. It's not so vital issue to most of the Indo-Pacific, right? The vital issue is this: there is only one America. Whatever you do or do not do in Russia, there is still only one America, and we need you to balance China. And so we will do what we need to do in order to maintain a good relationship with you, in order to balance China.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I actually am going to turn to the audience now just because I'm aware of the time. We have 20 minutes left, and so thank you so much, everybody, for sitting here for an hour and 10 minutes patiently. I'm not sure if there's a microphone in the room. Okay, yeah, there is. Okay, so please raise your hand if you have a question. You can direct it to any of the speakers. You can pick. You have the mic. You have the power.
Oh, thank you. We spoke about the U.S.-Russia-China triangle.
Can you just identify where you're from?
Sorry, excuse me, of course. My name is Pavlo Zvonihorodsky. I'm a first-year MSF student, School of Foreign Service. I'm an international student from Ukraine. So we spoke about the U.S.-Russia-China triangle. Could we speak a little bit about U.S.-EU-China triangle and think what would Trump presidency and potential tariffs on the European Union would mean for this triangle and the relationship between the US and Europe versus the relationship between EU and China? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that has been very noticeable is that the EU can't seem to unite on a China policy. There are such different views between Germany, who has great need for the China market in such things as automobiles, and others within the EU, such as Denmark and others who are much more tough on China. So going forward, I would expect the Europeans to be uncomfortable with Trump's China policies. For example, if he really does levy, 60 or 100% tariffs on Chinese goods, this will be very disruptive, and not just in East Asia, but also in Europe. So I think that the European community is going to have just a tremendous difficulty with Trump. If, for example, Trump moves quickly on a Ukraine ceasefire and does not consult the European governments adequately, this could be extremely disruptive to NATO. So it's going to be a rough ride. I would predict maybe the roughest ride initially is really going to be with Europe, and that obviously bleeds over into China policy.
Would anybody who's joining online like to answer that question or weigh in on that question?
Can I chip in?
Of course.
Well, I think Trump may get EU and China closer in economic areas, even though EU countries are very diversified when it comes to relations with China, as Dennis correctly noted. But overall, many EU countries view China as important economic partners, and they want to, further enhance this relationship because, it's really mutually beneficial one for both sides. And also, as Trump becomes more unilateralist on broad international agenda, EU will need China's cooperation on issues like climate change, promoting WTO rules, and many other issues related to globalization and global governance. So in that sense, yes, there is a triangle relationship among US, EU, and China, mostly in economic terms. And Trump will provide opportunity for EU and China to draw closer to each other in the next several years. Yeah.
Perhaps we can collect another question, just make sure other people have an opportunity. Yep.
Hi, thanks for the wonderful panel. I'm Jerry. I'm a student at George Washington University. I would like to propose a question about Trump's recent comments regarding BRICS, where he threatened to pose 100% tariff on the BRICS if they try to develop a new currency to replace the US dollar. I was wondering how realistic this is in terms of discouraging the BRIC countries of actually doing so. And do you think it's more of a, as we mentioned, negotiating tool for Trump?
Ambassador Kasakan or Professor Da, do you have?
Let's answer that first.
Okay.
All right. BRICS is nonsense. BRICS represents a mood. It does not represent any real convergence of interest. So it was a very simple thing for Trump to say that, because it's not going to happen anyway. Right? So I don't know why he said it. I don't think he really thinks that BRICS is a real alternative to the American dollar as a reserve currency. I don't think BRICS is a real alternative to the current state of international order. But he said it. But it's nonsense. I wouldn't take it seriously. Why are we discussing this? I would like to go back briefly to the previous question. Look, there is a very complex international system now. It's no longer unipolar. It's not quite multipolar, but it's much more in the direction of multipolarity. And we shouldn't get distracted by various statements by world leaders, whether they are Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden or Mr. Xi Jinping or whoever. Let's look at the facts. The facts are this. There is a world order that was predominantly American, but it was only predominantly American for a very short period of time. Maybe from 1989, when the Berlin Wall went down, to 2008, when the global financial crisis broke out. All other times in world history, the world order is not a matter of consensus. It's a matter of contention. It was so for 40 years of the Cold War. We lived through that. We are living through that again. Let's get real. And let's get a certain sense of perspective. What I think is behind many questions in international relations today is an assumption that is false. The assumption is that that short period between 1989, more or less, 2008, more or less, is the norm. That was not the norm. That was the exception. We are now back to the norm. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you everybody for a wonderful presentation. I wanted to ask a little bit about something Professor Dawei alluded to that we haven't talked about that much yet, which is, Professor Dawei, you mentioned that during Trump 2.0, not only trade and investment, but perhaps people-to-people relations would also suffer very negatively. So I was wondering if you and any of the other panelists would speak a little bit more about the effect of Trump 2.0 on this aspect of bilateral relations between China and the U.S. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Da.
Yes, I don't know what will happen, but I know that we know that in his team there are some people who, for example, advocate for comprehensive Chinese students ban in the first term, and also, from no matter it's from the immigration perspective or from technological competition perspective, want to restrict the Chinese students studying in the United States. And also, if we have something bad happen between the two sides politically or diplomatically, the atmosphere could become very bad. Then we may see more like harassment at the border. We may, the scholars and the businessmen may have bigger concern traveling to the other side. So maybe not, a real policy change, but the atmosphere change could lead to some very negative outcome in people-to-people tie. So this is my concern, but so far I don't have any, specific, policy to worry. Just the atmosphere, yes.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps, Dennis, you want to say something about this? I know you're taking a group of students from Georgetown University to China in the spring, and there's a U.S. student dialogue between Georgetown and some universities in China. So what is your view on people-to-people exchanges? This is also something I'm personally very concerned about because I'm planning to visit China next year for research, so I'm hoping that scholarly exchange continues.
Well, I share your concern and Dawei's concern on this question. There are people very close to Trump who have advocated that we should simply cut off visas for Chinese students coming to the United States to study. I don't know how strong that view is within the Trump inner circle. Fortunately, I think those people will be preoccupied with immigration issues, at least initially, and that will take an awful lot of their energy. I'm hoping their energy will be diverted in that direction to some degree. But we do suffer on the people-to-people. As you already know, there are only about 900 American students in China today. The number of Chinese students coming to the United States has come down significantly. I think the latest figures are about 270,000 now. That's at least 100,000 below the peak. And this is a real danger across our societies. This is the long-term damage of not having American students spend time in China, not having Fulbright scholars, for example, in China and Hong Kong, by the way. They are restricted out of Hong Kong at this point. I worry about it because if all of our China hands in the future get trained in Taiwan, this is going to skew our perspective. And I think that is a difficulty.
Yes, we have another question here.
Hi, my name is Zoe. I'm a senior undergrad in the School of Foreign Service. I have a question about chips. So essentially, given the ever-increasing importance of semiconductors and China's current inability to have self-sufficiency in chip making, how will the importance of Taiwan's chip manufacturing capacity impact China-U.S. relations in the future? Thank you.
Okay, would anybody like to address that question?
I will say one thing, and then I'll let other people elaborate on it. TSMC is the foremost chip fabricator in the world. There is no doubt about that. However, it is only a contract manufacturer. It is diversifying its manufacturing to Japan, to the US. It's looking around in Southeast Asia, it's looking around in India. So I would beg you to think of it in that framework as a contract manufacturer. Thank you.
I think that the importance of TSMC in Taiwan in semiconductors is inevitably going to decline. We are putting enormous money in the United States into the development of fabrication facilities around the United States. And so unless the Trump administration suddenly pulls all that money back, and I don't think they will because many Republican districts are benefiting from this money, there's inevitably going to be a change. And there will be a shift. TSMC itself is building in Arizona. Apparently that plant is now going well. At first it didn't go well, but now we're hearing more positive news out of that facility. And so I think if you will, I think we're passing the high point of the importance of Taiwan in chip manufacturing.
Let me just add one point to this question. I think Taiwan's company doesn't make the advanced chips in vacuum. Actually, they are dependent on other partners, including those partners from the Chinese mainland when it comes to raw materials and also the manufacturing capacity. So, including even the U.S., today with the most advanced technology, it cannot, make the chips on its own. The supply chain, the production chain is a long and complicated situation. And, you just cannot say, one particular actor can, make all this happen on its own. So that's it's just impossible, and it's not true.
Okay, I'd like to invite one more question, and then we'll have to conclude.
Thank you, professors, for this great panel. And this is Rehan, and I work for the Pulse Institute as a senior analyst before, and now working for the backseat advisory of BC-based consulting firm as a director of research. So my question will be like, what could be your future prospect for the U.S.-China relations? Because as we know, that the President-elect Trump has already brought up a new generation of MAGA, and most of them actually were born after the 1980s, and they could be the new generation of the United States politics in the future. And as we also know that most of them are very Chinese hawks, and even compared to Trump himself, most of them are even advocating to ruin Chinese political system. So my question would be like, compared to those new generation of MAGA, Trump could be considered as a little bit moderate on Chinese issues. So would that be the U.S.-China relations could get intensified after 2028 when the new cohort of MAGA came to power? Because we know that Trump cannot get reelected. Thank you.
Well, that is a very broad and probably good question to end on. It allows you to kind of try to see into the future and talk about beyond Trump, is the U.S.-China relationship going to continue down this contentious path or not? Or are there any kind of seeds of hope in the mix? Maybe Professor Dawei, you could start.
Yes. I think in the long run, the U.S.-China relations has to be stabilized sooner or later. So to achieve that, I mean, if we can go back a little bit, I mean, China-U.S. relations had been relatively positive after the end of the Cold War because the two sides share the similar set of belief about the domestic development. Basically, I will say the new liberalism thing. So we share something in common in the old model, but now we are obviously shifting from the old model to a new model in which we have a lot of conflicts. Until, I mean, in this new model, we have to sooner or later be stabilize the bilateral relations because neither side want a war or conflict. So I think the gentleman raised the new cohort, new generation of American politician. I mean, the two sides have to maybe it take times, and maybe also we have to pay some cost to understand the other side. Chinese understand the U.S. and vice versa, and realize that really understand what the other side want, what are their strategic intention. Before that, we can't have sustainable stability between the two sides. But I still think because these two countries are too big, too important, I think we will get to that new equilibrium sooner or later. Not very soon, but maybe in next, 4 to 8 years, that's possible.
Yes, Dennis?
Ray Hong, I'm not sure I agree with the premise completely of your question. I'm interested in the fact that younger Americans, when they take the polling, are actually friendlier to China than older Americans. And I think part of this is, and I use my son as an example, they've gone to school with Chinese. Chinese students come here to high school, they come here obviously to college, and American students have more interaction with Chinese than my generation or older generations. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is a little less of this in younger American generations, and that may be a cause for a little bit of hope.
Mm. Okay, Professor Wu?
Yes, well, my hunch is that we are going to have long, bumpy road ahead in the years ahead for this relationship, because partly because of the rise of the China hawks in the U.S. A generation of people. So under these circumstances, the priority issue is really not how to improve this relationship, but to do damage control to these relations. But at the end of the day, I think it's China that will help redefine this relationship. Because if one day the US finds out that it cannot really contain a rising China, and also the policy designed to contain China has largely failed and even hurt the US interests, then the US political elite may become more realistic and think about how to, coexist with a strong China. I mean, you don't have to like China, but I mean, China will be a reality that the US has to work with and coexist with for its own interests. I think that's something inevitable. So in the long term, I'm not that much concerned. Thank you.
And last word, Ambassador Kasakan. It's also very late there. We can see by your screen it's quite dark. But is there anything you would like to weigh in on about the future of the U.S.-China relationship?
Competition between major powers is a normal state of affairs. This is the norm. The short period or the very long period where cooperation outweighed competition was due to one factor. That factor was the Soviet Union. No Soviet Union, competition became the norm again. Now, competition is not conflict. I don't think conflict is inevitable because of one simple factor: nuclear deterrence. Both US and China are rational powers, and they will deal with each other as rational powers. Sometimes competition, tension will be predominant. Sometimes there will be less tension. And competition and tension, competition will coexist with cooperation. That is the nature of international relations. In other words, US-China relations are back to normal. And I think that is essentially a fundamental reality of international relations, which we have all, both the US side, the Chinese side, and third parties like my own countries, have not yet come to terms with. On that, rather, whether you can call it optimistic or pessimistic note, I shall end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would call it a realistic note. Thank you so much to all of our guests today, and thank you for attending this event. I hope everybody found it stimulating and interesting. Thank you so much, Dennis, Toya, everyone, for organizing. Thank you.